The fresh talks to reach a lasting truce in Gaza have been described as constructive.
A new round commenced in Qatar on Thursday amid efforts to avert a wider regional war. Israeli representatives are attending, but Hamas is not, saying they will consult if Israel responds positively.
The urgency of reaching a deal highlighted by the mounting death toll in Gaza, which has now crossed 40,000. This as the region braces for possible retaliatory strikes by Iran and its proxies for Israel's alleged assassination of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders. For more insight on the developments out of the Middle East, let's speak now with Javed Ali. He's an associate professor of practice, Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Professor, thank you very much for joining us. So the U.S. is calling this a promising start, but what is the likelihood of any progress being achieved with Hamas not in the room?
So, Jillian, Teresa, nice to be with you. And this is a very delicate moment in the region. Obviously, the United States is trying to exert a lot of diplomatic pressure and influence to get to the end state of the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. Now, with Hamas representatives not being there, that doesn't necessarily mean that their negotiating positions aren't being transmitted or received. But at the same time, this is even more complex now than in months past, because as you mentioned at the top of this segment, that there's the potential still for some type of retaliation from Iran and or Lebanese Hezbollah based on the two targeted attacks or strikes that Israel conducted against leaders in Beirut and Tehran now more than a couple of weeks ago. So there's so many different aspects and angles to this. And maybe one of the things that Iran and Hezbollah are waiting for is to see if there is a ceasefire deal. And if there is, then perhaps we won't see that escalation or their retaliation.
Professor, Hamas, they recently appointed Yahya Sinwar as its political chief after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh. You once described Sinwar as inflexible, and other reports have called him an uncompromising figure. How difficult will it be to negotiate with him?
Well, it'll be pretty difficult. And just given everything that we know about Sinwar's past, he's been with Hamas pretty much since the beginning of the organization. He served more than 20 years in Israeli jails. He's now being hunted by the IDF in most likely southern Gaza or Khan Yunis, where he was born. And just his personalities, it's been described, very hard-edged man. He's been responsible for the deaths of Palestinians themselves. He was an enforcer, a counterintelligence chief in Hamas. So this is a man who lives sort of by the sword and doesn't seem to have the same pragmatism that Ismail Haniyeh and others have had at the political level. But I also think the Hamas council that selected him was sending a message to Israel that they are going to now have to negotiate with someone who is very different than the previous political chief. So Sinwar is wearing different hats, but I also think just based on his background and his personality, he is going to be a much tougher person to negotiate with.
And we know these talks are focusing on finalizing that ceasefire agreement proposed by U.S. President Joe Biden. As it stands now, Professor, what would you say is the biggest sticking point?
Well, the sticking point is still, where is Israel in its campaign objectives that it started almost immediately after the attacks of October 7, 2023, is how far along are they in what they are trying to achieve in the elimination of the threat of Hamas to Israel? So does that mean they have to continue to kill and capture thousands more fighters? There's some estimates already saying about 17,000 Hamas fighters have been killed or captured. How much more of Hamas's weapons and infrastructure needs to be destroyed? And a lot of that is still probably buried deeply within this several hundred square mile tunnel network. Sinwar, as now the political chief and the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip, will Netanyahu and the IDF not rest until he is killed or captured? The status of the hostages, what comes next? Even if you can answer all of those questions or get to some point where Israel is satisfied, who will govern the Gaza Strip and potentially parts of the West Bank in the aftermath? I don't think Hamas, what's left of Hamas, will be acceptable to Israel or the West. But there doesn't seem to be a good alternative on that either. So these are all really sticky questions that haven't yet been answered.
And Professor, so how much influence can the U.S. exert on Israel over these negotiations? I mean, is there anything that could change Mr. Netanyahu's stance?
Well, it sounds like the U.S. is trying to do everything it can from the diplomatic front, and just look at the number of senior officials who are apparently on the ground in either Doha or Cairo, trying to hammer out portions of this deal. You've got the director of the CIA, who's been deeply involved, even though he's the head of the CIA as an intelligence organization, in meeting with the head of the Mossad, David Barnea, in trying to advance some of these talks. You've got the head of the Middle East policy in the National Security Council, Brett McGurk, who I knew in my government career, who's also on the ground. There's another third senior figure who's got a different portfolio in the White House, who's also on the ground. Secretary Blinken from the Secretary of State is also trying to do things. So the U.S. seems to be doing as much as it can diplomatically, but ultimately, these are going to be decisions that Israel and Prime Minister Netanyahu are going to have to decide, are they acceptable from their perspective? And I also think the return of the hostages, however many hostages, and it's sad to say, are still alive, that will be another key point to getting to an ultimate ceasefire.
On the military front, though, the U.S. has been deploying additional assets to the region, with the Pentagon saying that the goal is de-escalation. But how does this align with the objective of reducing tensions? I mean, is this increased military presence in the region really necessary?
Well, I think from the U.S. perspective, I'm trying to read between the lines of what's been said by different folks, President Biden, the Secretary of Defense, is that those very powerful capabilities, now 2 carrier battle groups, guided missile, submarine, all the existing naval and air power that we had in the region prior, it's not necessarily there to mount an offensive campaign against Hezbollah north of Israel or against targets directly in Iran. I think it's more there as a deterrent and show of force, but also if Iran and or Hezbollah were to try to conduct an attack that looked at some level like what Iran did against Israel in April of this year, where Iran launched a combination of about 300 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones, almost all of them which were intercepted, but mostly by U.S.-based platforms and capabilities and assets. That, I think, is why those capabilities are now in the region. Because, again, if the ceasefire doesn't materialize, if the talks break down, if Iran and Hezbollah are still going to try and do something, it may look like what we saw in April, but at an even greater scale and volume and sort of duration in terms of not hours, but potentially days.
And one of the main objectives, obviously, is to prevent a wider conflict. Should a ceasefire be reached? I know that's a big if, but if it is reached, how quickly will its impact be felt? How likely would Iran and Hezbollah stand down?
I mean, it's so hard to get into the minds of the supreme leader in Tehran and Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon. I think if a ceasefire can be reached, and again, it's acceptable at some level to all the parties involved, then I don't think Iran or Hezbollah will launch what they probably were considering in the immediate days after the strike against Fuad Shukr in Beirut and Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. That doesn't mean they still won't try to retaliate against Israel. And this is the pattern of Hezbollah and Iran and Israel. They've been fighting a shadow war for decades, almost 40 years. So I think the gloves will come off again, but the response will not be a response, if there is one, from either the Hezbollah or Iranians, like the large-scale attack that Iran launched in April. It'll probably be something that's more targeted, focused, and in their minds, sort of an eye-for-eye retaliation, one person being targeted versus trying to literally draw the entire region into a scale of conflict that we haven't seen.
All right, Professor, thank you very much, as always, for joining us on the program. Javed Ali, Associate Professor of Practice, Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan. Thank you.